Well, good afternoon, everybody. Today's presentation is something a little bit different from past ones I've done. So let's get right into it. Today, we're going to talk about the Great Halifax Explosion, which occurred on December 6th of 1917. And I suppose we should start with what exactly was the Great Halifax Explosion. So at 9:04 in the morning on December 6, 1917, the city of Halifax, Nova Scotia, was rocked by the biggest man-made explosion in history until the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The blast destroyed 3/4 of a square mile, pretty much beyond recognition, as you can see, get an idea from the bottom shot. Another 4 square miles suffered severe damage from the blast and subsequently fires. And of about 60,000 people who were in the Halifax area at the time, 1,600 were killed instantly. About 400 more died in the following days. Over 9,000 were injured, many severely. 6,000 were left completely homeless, and 25,000 were left with insufficient shelter. What that means is they had homes that were still standing, questionable safety, probably no windows, issues like that. So how did this happen? Well, that's a great question. But before we jump right into that, let me give a little bit of quick historical background. You probably remember this other disaster on April 23rd, 1912. The Titanic kind of bumped into some ice and 1,500 people died. Well, within a few hours that same morning, the White Star Line that owned the Titanic chartered a cable ship in Halifax, Nova Scotia, the Mackie Bennett, to go out and recover the bodies, not the survivors, but the bodies. They took on board 40 embalmers and a minister. They carried 100 coffins, 100 tons of ice, a whole bunch of canvas to wrap any extra bodies. And ultimately, they recovered 306 bodies. As we can see on the bottom right, 116 of those were buried at sea. In theory, at least, these were supposed to be third class and steerage passengers, although I'm not sure how they were able to determine that. But in any case, 190 passengers were brought back to Halifax. Bodies were brought back to Halifax. And they were met by a large number of ambulances, and the bodies were unloaded, and they were taken to a morgue, which had been established at the local curling rink. The coroner, John Henry Barnstock, handled those. He invented a system basically for tagging the victims with a unique number, identifying their belongings and packaging them separately with that same number, and a bunch of other things to identify the victims. As it happens, his son, Arthur Barnstock, was the coroner in Halifax when the 1917 explosion happened, and he used basically the exact same system his father had pioneered on the Titanic disaster. Well, let's get a little closer to the explosion. During World War I, German U-boats, Germany had a much inferior navy to the Allies, but they had 300 and some U-boats, and they used them to full advantage. They sank over 5,700 Allied and neutral ships during the war, killed over 15,000 seamen. The vast majority of those were prior to the middle of June of 1917. But by that time, good ships were getting very hard to find, and experienced sailors were in short supply. And that brings us to the Ss Mont Blanc. This was a tramp steamer built in 1899, speed maybe 10 knots on a good day. That's about 12 miles an hour. And on December 28th of 1915, she was purchased by the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, CGT, which was the agency in France responsible for coordinating wartime shipping. And this brings us to Montblanc's fatal voyage. In October of 1917, Captain Aimé Joseph Marie Lemedec assumed command. He was promoted to captain a couple of years earlier and commanded a couple of smaller ships, but this was definitely his biggest command. Immediately after he assumed the command, Montblanc was ordered to New York City to pick up an undisclosed cargo. On the way across, he had some issues initially because he was not perhaps an imposing figure. He was about 5'3", 120 pounds, and he was a little bit of a martinet. He was a strict disciplinarian, and his crew wasn't happy initially, but they began to realize that he was a fair man and a competent sailor. They arrived in New York on November 7th and were ordered immediately to a berth at Gravesend Bay in Brooklyn. That's in the outer harbor, not in the inner harbor of New York, but practically out in the ocean. And this was a surprise to the crew members who were used to going immediately to the inner harbor. They weren't sure what was going on. Well, they began to get some hints because as soon as the ship docked, shipwrights boarded the ship and commenced working round the clock to cover every square inch of the holds with every square inch of iron and steel with the combination of wood, cloth, tar, and rubber, all held in with copper nails. This probably should have given them a pretty good indication that something unusual was going on. When that work was completed, the stevedores on shore commenced 3 weeks of loading the holds under round-the-clock armed guards from the New York Police Department. It was a further hint of concern, perhaps, that the stevedores wrapped their boots in canvas to minimize the risk of stray sparks. And it soon became clear what was going on. One subsequent historian commented that she had a devil's brew aboard. She had 62 tons of gun cotton. This was used in high explosive munitions. She had 250 tons of TNT. Well, I think we all know what that is. And 2,366 tons of picric acid, something which people don't generally hear about and was largely unknown at that time. Trinitrophenol, TNP. This was a refined version of TNT, a upgrade, much more explosive. And to top it all off, after everything was tightly packed in the holds, the French government urgently requested that every square inch of extra space be filled with benzol, which was a relatively new, unknown, but highly volatile aviation fuel. In the end, 246 tons of benzol were added, 496 barrels stacked 3 deep on the open deck. And that was the cargo this ship was carrying. Well, what kind of protective measures do we have? Well, the threat being U-boats, she had 2 deck guns, 1 fore, 1 aft. If I were in that ship and a U-boat surfaced and was threatening to shoot at me, I don't think I would start the firefight, but that's beside the point. She also had 2 lifeboats, which after the Titanic disaster by regulation were sufficient to carry the entire crew and the pilot and any embarked passengers. She had connections, note connections, for a pressure hose on the forward deck, but there were no installed firefighting systems on the ship. Up on the bow, on the forecastle, she had 2 anchors that could be loosed instantly to secure the ship, to anchor it in place in the event of an emergency. And finally, as was the case with any ship carrying explosives, there was a possibility to scuttle the ship, to flood the holds by opening the seacocks. Unfortunately, this ship was getting old, it was not well maintained, and they figured it would probably take about ½ an hour to open the seacocks, and after that, about 2 hours for the hold to flood. Not really an inspiring preventive measure when you're carrying a load of, extraordinary load of high explosives. Well, on November 30th, Captain Madoc met with the British Navy representative in New York City, and he said, will you be able to keep up with an 8-knot convoy? Captain Madoc knew that his ship could theoretically make about 10 knots, but he had no idea how his ship would perform under this incredible load and in the stormy North Atlantic. So he said, quite truthfully, I don't know. As a result, he was not put into the convoy scheduled to leave New York. He was ordered to proceed unescorted to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he might possibly join a slower convoy or possibly be ordered to sail alone across the Atlantic. He was in fact given sealed orders to open in the event of that latter eventuality. Well, they left New York at 11 p.m. on December 1st, not accidental, late at night, because they wanted to minimize the risk of encountering the U-boats that might be lurking offshore. So they proceeded toward Halifax, and off the coast of Maine, they ran into some violent stormy weather. They had some harrowing times. The crew was constantly checking and securing the deck cargo and the cargo in the holds. But eventually, on the early morning of the 5th of December, They sighted the lighthouse at the approaches to Halifax. At 4 p.m., the Mont Blanc stopped at an examination anchorage near McNabb's Island. You can actually see that at the bottom center of the picture, not where the red arrow is. This was a picture stolen from something else, my apologies. But McNabb's Island was at the entrance to Halifax Harbor. And there was an examination station and some submarine nets that were to prevent submarines from getting into the harbor. And they got there at 4 p.m. At 4:30, the submarine nets were closed for the night, and Mont Blanc was forced to anchor outside of the submarine nets, basically, again, exposed to the U-boats until the morning. After they spent a harrowing night in the anchorage, desperately hoping that they would not be seen. Oh, well, let's leave them there for a moment and come up with another ship, the SS Imo. This was a Norwegian passenger ship, cargo steamer, about 431 feet long and narrow ship, launched in yes, that says 1989, my apologies, that's 1889. In 1917, she was chartered by the Belgian Relief Commission to bring supplies from the Americas to starving civilians in German-occupied Belgium. She had painted on the side, this is a pre-war photo on the bottom, but imagine a large sign about a third of the length of the ship painted in huge letters, Belgian Relief. As a neutral ship, she should have theoretically been free from the U-boat threat, but the Germans basically looked at any ships heading to France or to the United States as hostile. So it was hoped that this might protect the ship. They left Rotterdam in mid-November in ballast. In other words, they had water in their cargo tanks or whatever to keep the ship from riding too high in the water, but she had no cargo. She was heading to New York to pick up relief supplies with a Captain Haakam Vroom in command. They arrived in Halifax Harbor as a stop en route in order to refuel on December 3rd. On December 5th at 2:30 p.m., the Imo was cleared for departure from Halifax. Unfortunately, at that point, the coal that they'd been waiting for 2 days had not yet arrived. About 2 hours later, the barge came alongside and they were able to load coal, but not before, again, that submarine net had been closed for the night. So that night, while they were locked in the harbor, anxious to get out, the Mont Blanc was anchored outside the harbor, very much anxious to get in. Well, let's have a little tale of two anxious captains here. On December morning, 6th in the morning at 7:30, the Mont Blanc received orders to proceed to Bedford Basin. That was the farthest inner part of the harbor and await further orders. She was loaded. She didn't have to go to a dock anywhere. She just had to go to the anchorage where they assembled the convoys and, as it says, await orders. At 7:50, they hoisted their anchor. They proceeded inbound at 4 knots behind an American steamer, the SS Clara. It was customary, and in fact generally required, to raise a red flag over any ship carrying ammunition. The flag hoist for the letter B, Bravo. But Captain Medak declined to raise the Bravo flag because, again, concerned about the submarine threat, he didn't want to advertise what he was carrying. In addition to that, contrary to normal practices with explosive ships, no escort vessel was provided. So she was steaming on her own with just the captain, Captain Medak, and the pilot on board. At 8:10 in the morning, meanwhile, Imo received clearance to depart Bedford Basin on the far other extreme of Halifax, with a pilot named William Hayes on board, and they hastened to do so. Both ships had to pass through an area called the Narrows in order to reach their destination. That was the approach to Halifax Harbor. It was an area about 5 miles long, perhaps 1,000 feet wide, fairly constricted channel. Harbor regulations required ships to keep to the starboard side, kind of like we do with our car, right side of the road, and not to exceed 5 knots in the channel. Well, Captain Vroom on the Imo was anxious to make up for the lost time that he missed because his coal was late, and so he entered the Narrows at 7 knots and accelerating. He was already going too fast, and because of his need to maneuver to avoid ships in anchorage, he actually entered not on the starboard side of the channel, but on the port side of the channel. In other words, he was driving toward the oncoming traffic. Well, as the Clara, which was in front of Mont Blanc, and the Imo approached each other, they were both on the wrong sides of the channel. The Clara had been on the wrong side because she was aiming to a berth that was on the left side of the channel. And Emo was on the wrong side because that's where she entered the channel. So as a matter of convenience, they exchanged signals. Each one gave a toot of 2 horns, which was a signal that they agreed to pass starboard to starboard. In other words, both driving on the wrong side of the road. While this was not illegal, as long as there was mutual consent, it was a little bit of a departure, a substantial departure from the normal practice. The Emo was forced further to the east, the wrong side of the channel, by the approach of the tug Stella Maris. Actually, tug wasn't approaching, they were approaching the tug. Stella Maris was outbound in the middle of the channel with 2 barges in tow. They were near the middle of the channel to keep those barges from wandering too close to the shore. The captain of the Stella Maris saw the Emo was traveling at excessive speed, so he turned to the west, again, the wrong side of the channel, to avoid a collision. Meanwhile, pilot Mackay on the Mont Blanc saw the approach of the Emo, now heading toward them. Basically, again, you're on the interstate and somebody is driving toward you, not good. He signaled for the normal port-to-port passage, 1 blast on the horn. The Emo signaled for a starboard-to-starboard passage, 2 blasts. In other words, they did not have consensus. Captain Maydak at this point, seeing that the Emo was approaching rapidly, ordered the Mont Blanc signal, the Mont Blanc's engine stopped and steered her a little closer to the eastern shore. Again, he's driving on the right side of the road. At that point, each ship repeated its previous signal. The Emo signaling 2 blasts, let's pass port to port, and the Mont Blanc signaling, or starboard to starboard rather, the Mont Blanc signaling 1 blast, signaling, no, let's have the correct port to port passage. Again, we have not yet had a consensus and the 2 ships are approaching each other. Well, in a last minute desperate attempt to avoid collision, the Mont Blanc sharply steered to the left. Figuring that the Emo was set on his course, he turned to try to avoid the Emo. At that point, at 8:45 in the morning, the 2 ships were almost parallel when the Emo decided things were getting dangerous. And they signaled 3 blasts on their horn, which indicated they were reversing their engines. Unfortunately, that caused the Emo's bow to swing into the Mont Blanc's bow, and it pierced the number 1 hold. It also, the damage wasn't very great, but that knocked a number of barrels of benzol on the deck loose and spilled this highly flammable airplane fuel into the hold on top of the incredible explosive mixture that was in there. The Emo had their engines in reverse, and as they pulled away from the Mont Blanc, the scraping of the hulls together produced sparks, and that ignited the fuel from the benzol, starting a flame in the forward hold. Well, now let's remember, what kind of protective measures do we have on Mont Blanc? We got 2 guns. That doesn't help us in the current situation a whole lot. Probably wouldn't have helped them in any situation, but in any case, now we've got connections for a pressure hose on the forward deck. With no firefighting system, but even that pressure hose, it's on the forward deck. Where's the fire? On the forward deck. We can't get to the pressure hose. That's okay, because we got 2 anchors that can be dropped from the forecastle to secure the ship. And where are they? Forward of the fire. We can't get to them either. We got the possibility for a 2.5-hour process to flood the ship and possibly put the fires out. Yeah, not a good hope. So what's left? 2 lifeboats. The captain ordered the crew of Mont Blanc to abandon ship, and they did so, leaving the ship adrift. The engines were stopped, but the ship had forward momentum, had never come to a full stop. They abandoned ship and safely escaped to the shore opposite Halifax, and the ship proceeded to drift slowly into the Halifax shoreline, coming aground at Pier 6, by now fully ablaze. The Stella Maris that had been towing those 2 barges quickly anchored their barges, came over to where the Mont Blanc was, and attempted to fight the fire with their 1 fire hose. When they realized that was not going to work very well, they determined to tow the Mont Blanc to a safer area. By this time, small boats from 2 British and Canadian naval vessels had come over to assist. They initially had a 5-inch hawser. They decided that wasn't enough, so they sent for a 10-inch hawser that never came in time to be of use. Meanwhile, the Halifax Fire Department had bravely responded with Canada's first motorized fire engine. The closest fire company arrived with 9 men and the engine, the fire chief in his personal car. And crowds, meanwhile, seeing this blazing ship and the smoke coming from it, gathered to watch. There were a large number of children on their way to school. This was about 15 minutes before school started, so they all kind of stopped where they were, gravitated toward the shore. People who were not outside came to their windows to watch. And a railroad telegraph operator realized people fleeing from the shore yelled that it was an ammunition ship and it was going to explode. And so he warned approaching trains to stop. At 9:04:34 in the morning, the ship exploded. The shot on the right is a picture about 2 miles from the explosion, taken about 20 seconds after the explosion. Basically, a mushroom cloud was created, although this wasn't an atomic weapon. It was about 3 kilotons worth of explosives. That's a quarter or so of the Hiroshima blast, and it was monumental. You see on the left a stopwatch that was found in the wreckage subsequently ashore, stopped at 9:04 in the morning. So in 1/50th of a second, Montblanc was blown to shreds. Pier 6, which was built to withstand hurricanes, vanished from the face of the earth, and a 3,400 mile per hour blast wave leveled everything within a half-mile radius. 1/50th of a second. And in that instance, water all around the ship was vaporized and pushed away by the explosion, exposing the harbor bottom. A crater was dug in the harbor bottom. Huge rocks were hauled onto nearby ships. And seconds later, a 30-foot tsunami crashed ashore, caused by the water rushing in to fill the void around where Montblanc had been. 30-foot high wave rolled into the shore and proceeded to roll inland up to a point about 60 feet above sea level. Anything that wasn't well destroyed by then was further pulverized and stirred up. People that might have been alive in the wreckage were largely drowned. Some people were actually picked up and carried to high water where they had hopes for safety until the retreating water dragged them back into the harbor, and many of them were drowned. And followed quickly by, within a few seconds, a deadly rain of fuel oil, white hot metal fragments coming down throughout the Halifax area. There's almost nothing left of the Mont Blanc. 2 significant recognizable pieces remained. On the left, we see a piece of the anchor shaft, which eventually came down from the air about 2.3 miles north of the explosion site. And on the right, we see a piece of the forward deck gun, which landed 3.5 miles away in the opposite direction. That incidentally is mounted upside down, where the barrel looks kind of like a melted banana. It was actually forced upward by the explosion. There were other pieces. We see in the middle a large chunk of iron, basically unrecognizable, but not much bigger than sort of a softball-sized chunks. And the picturesque city of Halifax was devastated. Again, everything in half-mile radius was pretty much flattened beyond recognition. And beyond that, devastating damage out to a substantial distance. What happened to the Emo? Well, 7 people were killed, including Captain Fromm and the pilot and 5 crewmen. The blast and the tsunami pushed it aground on the opposite shore. After the war, it was salvaged and sold to a whaling company who managed within a few months to run it aground in Antarctica, where it was abandoned. And the shot of the remains shown on the bottom left look hauntingly like the profile that it provided when it was initially wrecked during the explosion in Halifax. There were other ships in the harbor, of course. The Stella Maris, you remember the tug that tried to fight the fire, was thrown up on the shore near Pier 6. Pier 6 isn't there, but on the bottom left, you can see the forward half of the Stella Maris, what's left of it. 19 of the 24 crewmen aboard died. That's actually, to me, kind of miraculous that 5 of them managed to survive that close to the blast. The SS Picton, shown on the far right in the top photo, was a munitions ship moored about 2 docks away. She had largely unloaded, but there were still things basically in ballast, explosives. She was set afire, and there were some heroic efforts involved to put that fire out and throw the remaining munitions into the harbor before she could explode. Another cargo ship nearby, Middleham Castle, was severely damaged. The SS Cologne and SS Caraca, these were a British and American ship that were moored at piers, about 2 piers inward from where Mont Blanc exploded. They were both loading horses to be taken to die in the war in Europe. The horses get the opportunity to die prematurely. The Cologne was loading horses, had 36 crewmen killed, and the ship was severely damaged. The Caraca was thrown across the harbor. All 45 men aboard were killed. And just as an aside, the horses that were on the ships or had not yet been loaded were all casualties to the explosion, which you can imagine after a few days lent unpleasant aspects for the searchers. Smaller vessels, the tug Hilford was blown out of the water. We see it on the right on top of Pier 9. There were 2 survivors. The tug Regus was sunk. I'm sorry, it was not sunk, but it was badly damaged with most of the crew dead. The tug Erg was damaged by the explosion and sunk, subsequently salvaged. The 2 Royal Canadian boats, Royal Canadian Navy boat actually, and a British Royal Navy boat that had come to help possibly fight the fire aboard Mont Blanc, were both blown to bits, and all but 1 crew member of those 2 boats was lost. Meanwhile, ashore, immediate urgent search and rescue was what needed to be undertaken. It was a spontaneous effort initially, taken by co-workers and family members who may have survived, by passers-by, quickly augmented by Army personnel stationed in barracks quite nearby, and shore parties from Canadian, British, and United States military vessels in port. The highest priorities obviously were finding the victims, and the second priority was clearing the roads and railways to allow help and further search and rescue operations. Well, organization remarkably and rapidly fell into place. Around noon, the Halifax Relief Commission was established under Lieutenant Governor McCallum Grant, who happened to be in town. It was coordinated or established to coordinate relief and rescue, and it in fact stayed in force until 1976. That seems sort of odd, but its later tasks involved dispensing funds to the victims in terms of medical support and in some cases pensions. Number of committees were established very quickly: Transportation Committee, Rescue Committee, Food Committee, Shelter Committee, Mortuary Committee. And in that latter regard, a morgue was established at Chebucto Road School, which was highly damaged, but Royal Engineers quickly cleared it out and made it usable. And coroner Arthur Barnstock, you remember the son of the man who handled the victims from the Titanic, went to work using the procedures established by his father. That was a trickle compared to what he faced, close to, well, I don't really know how many bodies he had to handle, but there were eventually at least 2,000 people who died, and probably at least 3/4 of those were recovered in one form or another. Well, the first word goes out at 8:49 before the explosion. Mentioned that a telegram had been sent out by Richard Coleman, shown here, to the station at Rockford, 4 miles away. He realized that the overnight train from St. John, New Brunswick, was inbound with about 300 passengers. He sent a telegram: hold up the train, ammunition ship on fire in harbor, making for Pier 6 and will explode. He was the first person really probably to acknowledge that. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. And it was in fact his last message. We see his stopwatch down there and his telegraph key, which were 2 of the few things that were recovered and eventually returned to his family. That train was stopped. It may have been running late, might have been stopped anyway, but in any case, by not coming in to the train station, which was very close to Pier 6, 300 lives were saved. Excuse me. Well, the news also spread like wildfire around the world. The initial news, based on sketchy information, wasn't always right, but we see on the 6th of December, the same day as the explosion, the headlines in Honolulu, 350 killed in Halifax, half a city is in flames. And it says, a vessel leaving the dock was rammed broadside. Well, they got that part wrong, but they got the disaster part right. Oklahoma City, hundreds died. Munition-laden ships collide. Well, that wasn't true. Only one of them was carrying munitions. But again, we got the scale of the disaster. Tacoma, Washington, hundreds die. Blast, tear down ship. Cruiser rams munition ship. Again, we got the wrong players, but we have the right results. The Bismarck, North Dakota, middle of nowhere. All of these being headlines on that same day, the 6th of December. So word was spread fast, although not always accurate. And again, those parts of the city that weren't completely overrun by the tsunami, the blast, right around breakfast time in the morning, people had stoked the fires for their stoves and their fireplaces, and all these nice warm fires. As the blast came through and knocked houses down, the embers were scattered through everything and fires were quickly started. Well, numerous firefighters were dead or injured in the explosion. We see on top the Patricia, that fine first motorized fire engine in Canada, before and after. All 9 men associated with that, including the fire chief, whose car is seen in the lower left, were killed. But firefighting had to go on. So we see the horse-drawn pumper in the lower right, what was generally the rule, and people trying to fight fires elsewhere in the city. The water pressure was low for a number of reasons, lots of problems. Hospitals were quickly overwhelmed. New hospitals were opened. Every hospital or hospital-like facility in the city and surrounding areas was quickly thrown into use. Here we see pictures of victims. These photographs are largely showing children because the photographers found that they were the poignant subjects. And in fact, a great many children were injured. The children I mentioned who were walking to school and were drawn closer to the explosion site to watch what was going on. We see lots of people in these pictures with bandages on their heads. Hundreds of people received injuries to their eyes. Over 40 were permanently blinded. Great number of children. And again, remember, those people who weren't drawn to the waterfront to watch the goings on were drawn to their windows. Well, when their windows were blown in by more than hurricane force winds, shattering the glass, lots and lots of injuries, if not to eyes, to people's faces. In the lower left, we see burn injuries, terrible, terrible injuries. And again, 9,000 people injured, many of them seriously. The railroads proved to be a vital lifeline. The message that was sent out just before the explosion generated the first relief effort from the town of Truro, about 10 miles up the line. That train arrived remarkably fast at about 10 in the morning, loaded with medical personnel and medical supplies. And it was immediately loaded with wounded and returned to Truro. When the train got there with 1 doctor and 1 nurse and an entire trainload of casualties aboard, they discovered that all the medical people in Truro had gotten off the train in Halifax. So they had to stay there and care for those victims. On the bottom right, we see a Canadian military ambulance train used to take the wounded personnel from World War I away from Halifax. And these were pressed into use. But by nightfall on that first day, a dozen trains had arrived in Halifax with aid largely in the form of medical personnel from destinations farther and farther away. Temporary hospitals were quickly set up. We see in the top right, the Knights of Columbus Hall. We see the YMCA. If you look closely, you can see the running track around the top and the basketball backboard at the top center. And any place else that had intact structure. I don't know what the one on the bottom right is, but if you look closely, you can see that some of the windows are boarded over. And the USS Old Colony had just arrived in Halifax. This was a coastal passenger steamer built in 1907. In November of 1917, it was purchased by the United States Navy and temporarily christened as USS Old Colony, with the goal that it would be transferred to the British Navy as a troop ship. But it was there in Halifax. It was immediately pressed into service as a hospital ship, initially staffed by medical personnel from the various naval vessels that were in the harbor. Other naval responses, well, HMS High Flyer, a very famous World War I British cruiser. One of their boats was sent and the crew blown up, but otherwise the ship was intact and the crew was safe, and they immediately responded with a large number of personnel to help as shore parties with the search and rescue efforts. HMCS Niobe, His Majesty's Canadian ship. This was a former British ship that had been turned over to the Canadian Navy and was being used as a receiving ship, basically a place where sailors initially reported and got their basic training. She was severely damaged. About 30 crew members were wounded, and I think 6 or 7 died, but nonetheless, her remaining crew members in large numbers, as with High Flyer, immediately responded to rescue operations ashore. Well, the revenue cutter, subsequently Coast Guard cutter Morrill, US, top right, was in port, and she immediately sent shore parties ashore. And in fact, after the event, the Secretary of the Treasury, who was responsible for the revenue cutters in Washington, D.C., received a note from the British ambassador saying that the Morrill had been the first vessel to respond to the needs of the people in Halifax. USS Tacoma, this was a ship that was passing Halifax about 50 miles at sea when the explosion happened. They felt the blast wave so strongly that they thought they had been attacked by a German submarine and went to general quarters. When they realized that was not the case, they realized something humongous had happened and proceeded to Halifax. And within 4 hours, they were assisting also with rescue operations. The Uss Von Steuben was close to the Tacoma. This was a troop transport ship, which interestingly was formerly the Kronprinz Wilhelm, which for a time had been the fastest passenger ship in the world. At the beginning of the war, the Germans made it into a cruiser raider kind of ship. They armed it and it wandered the North Atlantic as they could outrun anybody that might be trying to chase them. They sank about 15 ships before they ran low on supplies and went into New York, which was at that point, the Americans not being in the war, a neutral port. However, they were interned by the US government, and when the United States entered the war in 1917, the ship was seized and became a US Navy ship. Well, 25,000 people left homes. Not necessarily, some of them had homes, like the home you see in the center at the bottom left. People stayed in homes like that, but it certainly did not provide warmth, minimum shelter, and they were frequently very unsafe. In the bottom of right, we see a couple of people sorting through the remains of their home, trying to find anything salvageable. These people had lost everything they had. And if that wasn't enough, the next morning, a blizzard struck Halifax, buried the city and its surroundings in 16 inches of snow, substantially, basically stopping all incoming relief for about a day. Relief trains from Boston and Maine managed to arrive finally on the morning of December 8th. A superhuman effort was made by civilian and military personnel to clear the railroad tracks and repair them as necessary to keep the train service open. Well, help from near and far. On the morning of December 6th, a Boston banker received a curious telegram from his agent in Halifax. It said, "Organize a relief train and send word to Wolfville and Windsor to round up all doctors, nurses, and Red Cross supplies possible to obtain. Not time to explain details, but list of casualties is enormous." A little bit nebulous. The people in Boston tried to get more information from authorities in Washington, D.C., who had less of a clue than they did. And the governor of Massachusetts, who was quickly brought into the loop, said, "We're not going to wait." So he immediately organized a train, loaded it with medical personnel, food, medical supplies, and within 10 hours, it was on its way to Halifax. We see his telegram or his response to the mayor of Halifax. On the bottom, it says, realizing that time is of utmost importance, we have not waited for your answer, but have dispatched the train. Meanwhile, in Halifax, no rest for the living, at least at the morgue. Hundreds of bodies coming in. We see on the left with the blizzard happening, basically the only way to move people was by horse-drawn conveyances, in this case, a sledge. If you look closely, you can see a stack of stretchers, and on the right side, a body covered in a blanket. The bodies were brought to the morgue, which we showed you before. On the bottom left, we see a picture of a business in Halifax, which was in the business of supplying coffins. They were turning them out as fast as possible and bringing them in from elsewhere. And as the bodies were identified, mass funerals were held as quickly as possible to clear room for more casualties. Meanwhile, again, life went on for the living. People desperately needed food, clothing, shelter, household goods. They needed everything. They lost everything. In many cases, surprisingly, even the clothes on their bodies. There were quite a few people. There was one man who was fairly near the site of the explosion. He came to shortly afterwards, lying on a hillside a half-mile away with nothing on but his boots. And yet he was uninjured. But in any case, people had lost everything. On the top center, we see a photograph of the Relief Commission's offices where people were coordinating, matching the needs to the available resources. Top right, we see a bunch of children who have just gathered boxes of food. Bottom left, we see a tent city. These are army tents, which had been rapidly brought in and set up as urgent temporary shelters. As fast as other places could be made habitable, people were moved into buildings in whatever condition. On the bottom right, we see a warehouse filled with household goods. Everything, as you see, baby carriages, furnishings, anything anybody might need. The train from Boston was followed within 24 hours by a cargo ship filled with supplies, more medical personnel, and rather good foresight, also had a large number of building tradespeople in it who proved to be a big help to the people in Halifax. Schools, churches, businesses, infrastructures of all kinds needed to be rebuilt before the city could get back on its feet. We see top left, a school. In the top center, the convent of St. Mary. Bottom right, a 5-story brewery along the shoreline was blown down to very little. A cotton mill in the center, and on the bottom right, we see workers clearing out the train stations. Within 2 days, a temporary train station had been established on the edge of town, and within 4 days, the main train station had been cleared out and made fully operational. But most of all, people needed a place to stay. Well, action was fast and dramatic. A U.S. naval observer in the port said things here will be months before the city can get back into operation. Port is rendered absolutely useless. In fact, the first convoy to leave Halifax after the disaster left town on the 11th of December. That's 4 days after the disaster. Docks were quickly made as serviceable as possible, and things were, from that point of view, were functioning fairly quickly. On the top right, we see a bunch of temporary buildings erected as temporary housing for citizens using prefabricated buildings that have been sent from Boston. These were, this photograph is taken about 2.5 weeks after the explosion, and those buildings are already in place. Bottom left, we see a close-up of the Governor McCall apartments. Governor McCall, the governor of Massachusetts, and these apartments, one of the streets going through the center of the complex was named Massachusetts Avenue. On the bottom right, we see more permanent structures which were rapidly being built. Some 300 single-family homes were built in the early months after the disaster, in addition to an army of tradesmen who were spread about the city, making any existing structures habitable as quickly as possible. Well, lasting gratitude at this point we have between the people of Canada and the United States. Although aid poured into Canada from all over the world, they recognized that the first and most critical response had come from the people of Boston. And as a result, to this day, every year, the people of Halifax send the people of Boston a Christmas tree, which can be seen on the right side of this picture. There was a dark side to all of this. While most of the victims of the disaster received fast and excellent support, as well as lifelong medical care and pensions, there were two groups that received very little immediate aid, and there were no efforts made at reconstruction. The native Mi'kmaq, who had a village that was completely wiped off the face of the earth by the tsunami, and many of the tribe members were killed. Those who survived were given temporary housing in segregated housing and eventually dispersed throughout Canada. The tribe pretty much ceased to exist. On the bottom left, we see some women from Africaville. This was a suburb of Halifax where African Americans lived, and Africaville being a poor area, the houses were mostly not very substantial, largely completely destroyed, and these people had great difficulty getting aid. None was sent to them. They had to come for what they could get. And in the long run, there was no reconstruction provided for their community. Among other reasons, the better reasons was that the city of Halifax had hoped to use the area where they lived as an industrial area. But the result is there were clearly some racial overtones, undertones to the way the aid was distributed. Well, in the aftermath of this, who's responsible? The initial response was we blame the Germans. Maybe it was a submarine, or maybe it was an airplane. We just know there was a big explosion. And so immediately the army troops in town manned their anti-aircraft barriers, the anti-submarine nets were closed. German citizens were rounded up and interned for several weeks. The helmsman aboard the Emo was badly injured, but somebody said he was acting suspiciously before the explosion. So they searched his belongings and found a letter in German. Well, no, it turns out it was actually written in Norwegian, his native language, but there was a great deal of suspicion toward the Germans. It abated, but never fully went away. The second response was, well, let's blame the French. People of Halifax were not at all fond of the French, historical animosity between the French and England in that part of the world. And the Emo was a French ship with a French crew. A judicial inquiry was commenced on December 13th, and within a couple of weeks, they put out a report blaming Captain Levedec, Pilot McKay aboard the Montblanc, and interestingly, Commander Wyatt, the Royal Canadian Navy's chief examining officer, the guy responsible for inspecting all the ships coming into the port. But all three were quickly acquitted by a Nova Scotia Supreme Court due to the total lack of evidence of their culpability. Well, the third response is frequently the case, civil litigation. Appeals were made by both sides, that is to say, the Emo's owners and the Montblanc's owners, ultimately going to the Supreme Court of Canada and the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, and with the final result that the share was blame was shared by both vessels and no action was taken. No one was ever found personally responsible, held responsible for any actions leading up to this disaster. So who did it? What happened? Well, start out, we certainly had the wrong ship for the job. It was not safe. It was not a good ship. It was an old ship. It had a new captain who didn't fully know the capabilities and limitations of a ship. It was grossly and criminally overloaded. Lax measures, they didn't fly the red flag. There was no escort vessel. There was no explosive anchorage designated where the ship could be safely moored away from other things. Poor communications between port officials. The military port officials and the civilian port officials were having a major turf battle, and basically neither one told the other anything, which impaired sharing of information about the cargo of this ship. Poor communications, well, we had foreign crews on both ships, language barriers. And I have highlighted in red the Emo's haste. They were in a hurry to get out. They were going too fast. They took the way of convenience on the wrong side of the channel. And when they were approaching the Mont Blanc, the simple solution would have been to yield the right of way, pull off to the right, and pass in the normal manner. And finally, I note the lack of noble sacrifice by the Mont Blanc's crew. Someone at least could have perhaps stayed on board, got the engines running, and steered it away from the shore to an isolated area. And that's what I have for you today. So I turn it back over to the moderators, and if anybody has any questions, I'll certainly do my best to answer.
Okay. Hi, Dan. Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay, I have two questions. The first is from David Peterson. He asks, how did this explosion compare to the fertilizer explosion in the Mid-East Harbor in 2020?
It was about twice as large.
Wow. Okay. And the second question comes from William Linden. Was the engine named after Patricia of Connaught, like the PPCLI?
I have no idea. I just know that that was the name that was given to it. It could have had some great national or international significance. It could have been the name of the fire chief's daughter.
Okay. And those are all the written questions that oh wait, no, I have another one from Steve. Can you compare the blast of the explosion to the 1916 Black Tom explosion in New York City? You mentioned Halifax was bigger than any explosion until the atomic bombs, but is a comparison possible?
Yes, and I had some statistics, excuse me, some data on that, which I can't bring immediately to mind, but it was an order of magnitude larger than the Black Tom explosion, which was another munitions ship during World War I, where in fact, German agents were blamed and probably were in fact culpable. But this was many, many times more powerful than that explosion. That explosion, however, did result in a much better response in terms of improved regulations and handling procedures.
Okay. I do have an additional question from Michael Safina. Considering the length of time the commission stayed in place, were reparations ever made to the native tribe or Africaville communities?
Definitely not to the native tribes, and I don't believe to the Africaville community. Again, I mentioned the commission stayed in place until 1976. After the first few months, that was largely to administer the financial support of the victims. And as far as I know, that support was largely, if not completely, denied to the minority personnel or people, communities in the area.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, any other questions? Oh, wait a minute, one more. Okay, let's see. From Kurt, have they ever attempted to locate any of the Mont Blanc's wreckage on the harbor bottom, or was it totally obliterated?
I'm not aware of any formal efforts to recover it. I'm sure that dredging operations were conducted, and I'm entirely sure that they recovered pieces, but like the pieces that were equally distributed over several square miles of Halifax, largely they were tiny, tiny shreds. So probably even if they recovered a chunk of metal, say this year, a chunk of metal the size of a book from the bottom of the harbor, there would be no way of being sure of its origin.
I don't believe I have any other questions at this time.
All right, well, it's been my pleasure. And again, if anybody has further questions, I'm sure you can direct them to the museum and they will get to me or some other wise person, and we can do our best to answer them. So again, thank you all for being with us today, and have a safe and wonderful spring.
Thanks everybody for joining.